The monastery stands as a stone witness to vows made in silence. Its walls are thick, its windows narrow, and its gates heavy with the promise of separation from the world. Within these walls, men and women once believed they were wrapped in the holy cloak of chastity, a discipline meant to draw them closer to God. The vow of chastity is described in canon law as a sacred shield, a protection against sin, and a sign of spiritual perfection. Yet the reality behind the cloister door was never as simple as the doctrine that shaped it. For every record that praises the sanctity of the religious life, another whispers of bodies and desire concealed beneath robes of prayer. The tension between ideal and reality is not merely anecdotal, but is preserved in documents, penitentials, and trial records across medieval Europe. The vow itself, known as the votum castitatis, was absolute, unlike clerical celibacy, which prohibited marriage but often allowed less visible transgressions. The vow of chastity bound the entire life of the monk or nun to sexual abstinence. To break it was to violate the very foundation of religious identity. Yet medieval penitentials, those handbooks of sin and penance written between the 7th and 12th centuries, devote entire sections to sins of the flesh committed by monks and nuns, suggesting that infractions were not rare but recurrent enough to demand systematized discipline. The monastery was designed as a fortress against temptation. High walls cut off the sight of towns, and market schedules of prayer filled the hours from dawn to midnight, and silence was enforced at meals and in corridors. The architecture itself was intended to discipline desire dormitories without privacy, refectories for collective meals, chapels echoing with chants that suppressed individual voice. Yet historians note that human nature is not dissolved by stone. Archaeological evidence from monastic sites shows that concealed passages, gardens, and secluded chambers often became spaces for encounters hidden from the formal life of the cloister. The contradiction emerges in surviving records. In the 12th century, Bishop Hildebert of Lavardin wrote that he had found in monasteries not angels, but men subject to the same weakness of flesh as any farmer or merchant. His statement, careful and restrained, reflects a wider clerical anxiety. The monastery, meant to embody purity, was also a site where sexual desire found secret expression. The vow of chastity thus became both a symbol of holiness and a measure of failure. One lesser-known detail appears in the rules of the Cistercian order. Their constitutions include prohibitions not only against interaction with women, but also against excessive affection between brothers. The language is coded, but unmistakable monks were cautioned against embracing one another too frequently or visiting each other's cells at night. Such prohibitions reveal that even same-sex intimacy was acknowledged as a recurring problem. The very act of legislating against it suggests its presence. Scholars of canon law observe that the repetition of certain prohibitions is itself evidence that the practice they targeted was widespread. Behind the idealized image of celibate prayer, a hidden world of flesh persisted. At the planetary scale, the monastery represented an attempt to withdraw from the chaos of medieval society. While towns expanded, markets grew, and Europe experienced both famine and plague, the cloister offered a microcosm of order. Yet the withdrawal was incomplete. Desire which crosses all boundaries was carried within. Some historians argue that the enclosure intensified temptation for the human body does not respond to vows as the mind does. Silence, fasting, and prayer might suppress outward expression, but inward longing could find cracks in the wall. The unresolved mystery lies in how widespread these scandals truly were. Surviving records are uneven. Some monasteries left no trace of scandal, while others became notorious in chronicles and letters. Were the silent houses truly pure, or did their secrets simply remain better hidden? Scholars debate whether the examples we know represent the exception or the norm. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, yet the weight of penitentials and episcopal complaints suggests that hidden transgressions were common enough to shape ecclesiastical law. The narrative of purity and the reality of desire existed side by side, intertwined like shadow and light on cloister stones. The monastery was also part of a larger landscape of religious discipline. In the 11th and 12th centuries, reform movements such as the Cluniac and Gregorian reforms sought to restore strict observance of celibacy among clergy and monastics. The repeated need for reform indicates recurring failure. Contemporary chroniclers speak of monasteries that fell into laxity, where the cloister became indistinguishable from the village where monks kept concubines or nuns bore children. These reports are not neutral. They often come from reformers eager to demonstrate the need for stricter control. Yet even with bias accounted for, the evidence points to a pattern. Beneath the chant of psalms, there were whispered meetings, secret gestures, and bodies that remembered their own hungers. A subtle scale of distance helps us understand. A vow of chastity was intended to last a lifetime, decades of suppression, often beginning in adolescence. For comparison, it is longer than the span from the fall of Rome to the reign of Charlemagne, a stretch of centuries condensed into the length of a single life. To expect the human body to remain untouched by desire across such a span was a demand rarely fulfilled. The holy cloak of chastity, so venerated in sermons, was in practice a garment constantly at risk of tearing. Some penitentials prescribed penances as if they expected failure, years of fasting for intercourse, months of prayer for inappropriate touch, weeks of silence for lustful thoughts. The gradation of punishments itself charts a map of desires that could not be eradicated, only managed. This first glimpse behind the monastery door reveals a paradox. The vow of chastity, meant to elevate, also exposed the limits of human capacity. The monastery, imagined as a fortress of holiness, became a place where silence and stone contained not only prayer, but also desire. The hidden world of flesh was not an aberration, but an inevitable shadow of the vow itself. In the stillness of cloisters, where footsteps echoed and chants rose at fixed hours, the human body remained insistent and unyielding. The holy cloak covered it, but never erased it. The vow of chastity was meant to separate the monk or nun from the pull of the flesh, binding them instead to a life of prayer, fasting, and contemplation. But in practice, the vow itself became a spark that inflamed curiosity and longing. The monastery was a world closed off, a place where young men and women, many of them entering not out of genuine devotion, but because their families pushed them into the cloister, were locked away with their own bodies and the unrelenting silence of isolation. What seemed like safety from sin often turned into a breeding ground for temptation. Medieval commentators knew it well. Remove people from the rhythms of daily family life, from the moderating influence of the outside world, and you heighten their susceptibility to desires that cannot be expressed openly. The monastic enclosure created intensity. Monks lived together in dormitories, nuns shared their cloisters and gardens, bound to see the same faces day after day. Even the smallest touch, an accidental brushing of hands, a lingering look across the choir stalls could stir forbidden thoughts. There were countless sermons warning that the devil thrived most within the walls of monasteries, whispering into the ears of those who thought themselves safest from temptation. And there was some truth to that warning. When a monk who entered the cloister at 14 reached the age of 25, the pressure of his vow could feel unbearable. For nuns, many of whom entered at even younger ages, the same struggle arose as the natural rhythm of their bodies clashed with the strict demands of spiritual purity. At times, temptation came from within the monastery itself. Stories circulated of monks secretly slipping into the quarters of nuns in double monasteries, where men and women lived in proximity, but were meant to be separated by walls and strict rules. Inevitably, the rules failed. Accounts survive of abbots chastising their brethren for climbing fences, passing secret letters, or arranging midnight meetings in the orchard. Even in single-sex monasteries, the enclosed nature of the life made desire between members nearly inevitable. When every glance was charged with forbidden meaning, the heart was quick to cross lines, the mind tried to forbid. At other times, temptation came from the outside. Local villagers, servants, or even wealthy patrons of a monastery sometimes found their way into hidden corridors. Outsiders brought news of the world laughter gifts, or the thrill of an entirely different life, and these encounters sometimes ended in secret affairs. Stories tell of nuns allowing men to scale convent walls, or bribing guards to open gates in the dark. In one notorious record, a nobleman disguised himself as a woman to sneak into a nunnery for weeks before being discovered. The mixture of austerity and repression gave such scandals their dangerous allure. Every forbidden act was heightened by the risk, the sense of committing a transgression against both God and man. The Church tried to anticipate such dangers by imposing physical barriers, walls so high they cast permanent shadows, strict enclosure rules, forbidding nuns from stepping outside, and prohibitions against monks even speaking to women. Yet these barriers often had the opposite effect. What is declared utterly forbidden becomes the most tempting. The penitentials, those medieval manuals of sin and penance, reveal how widespread the problem truly was. They record in shocking detail the various acts committed, the precise confessions required, and the penances prescribed. These texts meant, as guides for confessors, are also accidental archives of human longing listing sins that could only have become common enough to require codification. One reads not only of men and women together, but of nuns with their confessors, monks with lay women, even priests sent to oversee convents who fell into the very sins they were supposed to prevent. The vow of chastity thus became a paradox designed to free the soul. It instead trapped the body in a heightened awareness of its own hunger. What was denied in daylight often erupted in the secrecy of night. For many, these eruptions took the form of thoughts, fantasies, or whispered conversations that never crossed into action. But for others, they led to scandalous liaisons that left behind tangible evidence: pregnancies, abandoned infants, confessions wrung out under pressure, or whispers that spread from village to village. It is striking that medieval observers often wrote about this struggle not with shock, but with weary recognition. Preachers warned that the cloistered life, if not carefully balanced, was as dangerous as the open temptations of the city. Some even argued that monks and nuns fell into worse sins precisely because they were supposed to be models of purity. The secrecy of the cloister magnified the damage forbidden encounters could be hidden more easily. But once discovered, they carried the weight of betrayal, not only of vows, but of the entire church. To understand why scandals proliferated, one must grasp the human element beneath the holy cloak. Monks and nuns were not saints made of stone. They were human beings with desires they could not erase. The enclosed monastery created unnatural pressure. In that pressure, the vow of chastity, supposedly a shield, often cracked, and through the cracks poured the forbidden world of flesh that the walls could not truly contain. Within the cloistered walls of monasteries, where silence was considered a virtue and the body an obstacle to holiness, desire did not die. It merely changed form, became more secretive, more intense, more dangerous. The rules were clear. Monks and nuns were to renounce all worldly attachments, including love marriage and carnal contact. Yet despite the vow's forbidden relationships between men and women within these sacred enclosures persisted through centuries, leaving behind records, abandoned infants, and a trail of silence broken only by scandal. Monasteries were often segregated by gender, but not always. In some places, male and female religious lived in neighboring compounds served by shared chapels or kitchens. In others, noble patrons built double monasteries where monks and nuns resided under the same rule, sometimes even meeting for liturgical purposes. The church believed proximity could be managed through discipline, but human desire found its way into even the most regulated routines. Sometimes it happened gradually, two novices passing glances in the garden, speaking through the iron grill, leaving folded letters beneath altar cloths. In other cases, it was the result of hierarchy and imbalance, older monks taking advantage of younger women under religious tutelage, using spiritual authority to justify proximity prayer sessions or penance that led to intimacy. One of the most disturbing legacies of these affairs was the appearance of abandoned babies at monastery gates or buried within convent grounds. Medieval chroniclers speak of infants left to the will of God, some drowned in wells, others suffocated beneath the floorboards. These were often described as Christian hybrids, a term used not to celebrate their lineage, but to mock it. It was a cruel irony, children born of religious union, yet cursed to die without identity. In the Inquisition archives of the 14th century, one case details a nun in Aragon who had secretly delivered 3 children over 6 years each with different fathers from the nearby monastery. When the final infant was found alive and crying beneath the cloister's stairs, the scandal could no longer be buried. She was excommunicated, the monastery shuttered, and her name erased from public record. Other stories unfolded more discreetly. In France, an abbey sponsored by a noble family became the scene of persistent rumors. Nuns were said to take walks at night, veiled in black, but seen meeting local men beyond the orchard wall. The bishop's investigation uncovered hidden passageways between the convent and an adjoining estate. It was suggested that one of the young nuns was the illegitimate daughter of the abbey's benefactor, placed there for protection, but left with freedom others did not enjoy. No punishments were issued. Instead, the bishop issued a quiet reform and relocated several women to another convent hundreds of miles away. The higher the status of the participants, the more likely the church was to remain silent. In Italy, a Benedictine monastery in the hills of Umbria held within it the private chapel of a count who frequently visited. Over time, rumors swirled that he had fathered a child with the abbess herself. The child was baptized in secret, raised as a servant in the same convent, never told of his origin. It was only when the count's wife died and he left a portion of his estate to the boy that the truth emerged. The church swiftly seized the land, destroyed the chapel, and declared the matter closed. Not all forbidden affairs were entirely consensual. There are records in canon law collections that speak of confessional abuse, monks using their role as confessors to extract not only secrets but submission. In some monastic rules, particularly those written in the 12th century, one finds warnings against unaccompanied visitation of female monasteries by priests or friars, especially at night. These rules did not emerge from theory. They were written after scandal. In certain dioceses, visiting clerics were forbidden to speak with nuns without another sister present, and even then only in the open air. Perhaps most tragic were the cases in which true affection had formed, where the monk and nun, despite every warning and teaching, genuinely believed they had found love. Letters from the 13th century survive in the margins of manuscripts bearing gentle lines like, "Though I see you only in prayer, I carry your face into every hour." These lovers were rare and careful, but not immune to discovery. Punishments ranged from penance and relocation to forced monastic silence for the rest of their lives. What makes these affairs all the more striking is the brutality of the consequences. For a monk, it might mean expulsion or years of fasting. For a nun, it meant disgrace, exile, or death. A woman who became pregnant within the convent risked being buried alive, an act seen as cleansing the shame by removing the visible sign of sin. Some were locked away in tower cells, fed only bread and water, until they miscarried or died. In the words of one chronicler, her body was sealed in stone, but her soul may it find mercy. These forbidden love affairs were not just moments of lust. They were cracks in the architecture of holiness, revealing the profound tension between imposed purity and human longing. Monasteries were built as sanctuaries from the world, but within them the world did not vanish. It hid itself behind locked doors, beneath habits and hoods, waiting for a moment of contact, a whispered confession, or a shared breath in the candlelight. And when it surfaced, the church did all it could to ensure that the story would never leave the cloister. In the hush of stone corridors, where chants echoed in predictable rhythms, and the silence of obedience was praised above all, something else stirred low, persistent whispers that never made it into the official records, but lived in the private margins of human memory. These were not the voices of prayer, but of speculation, shame, and secrets. Word of scandal traveled not by proclamation, but by glance, by rumor, by the faint scrape of feet, in places they shouldn't be. Monasteries and convents, with their high walls and enforced chastity, did not only contain saints, they also became cages of repressed desire, and when that desire escaped, it left behind traces no stone could contain. The most damning whispers were about those who held power, abbots, bishops, confessors. Their role gave them access, and their authority allowed them to bypass scrutiny. In many cases, monks were the only men allowed to speak with nuns, especially in the context of spiritual guidance. Behind the thin veil of confession, abuses could and did occur. The seal of confession was sacred, but it also shielded predators. Within this dynamic, it became nearly impossible for victims to speak. Who would they tell if their only access to the outside world was through the very men who violated them? When nuns attempted to alert the church, their complaints were often dismissed as hysteria, temptation, or the devil's influence, suggesting that they had seduced the monk rather than been violated. In some monasteries, the worst offenses were not hidden from everyone. Servants, lower-ranking clerics, or lay brothers sometimes stumbled upon the aftermath: blood-stained garments, discarded infant remains, or sisters caught weeping behind the altar. These witnesses rarely spoke directly, but left behind oblique testimonies in letters, journals, or even the records of heresy tribunals. In one particularly disturbing case from a Flemish convent in the early 14th century, a kitchen servant testified decades later that she had seen a nun chained by her ankles in the underground crypt as punishment for forbidden conduct with a man of God. The man was never named. The woman he claimed wept without sound and wasted into dust. The Church was not ignorant of these possibilities. Canon law from the 12th century onward began to include increasingly detailed prohibitions. Monks were not to hear nuns' confessions alone. Male and female monastics were not to share liturgical spaces without strict separation. Windows between chapels were to be covered by curtains, and doors between male and female quarters sealed with 2 locks. These laws, however, were often ignored in practice, especially in isolated or noble-sponsored monasteries, where the benefactors themselves held influence over who was punished and who was quietly relocated. The whispered understanding among some clergy was simple scandal must never leave the cloister. It was not sin that disturbed the Church most, but the exposure of that sin to the outside world. But even within the cloister, those whispers could become unbearable. Some nuns left behind poems scratched into the wax margins of their psalters. "My voice is not heard, but my body remembers" reads one such line etched by a 13th century Cistercian nun in Burgundy. Another simply wrote, "Forgive me for surviving." These were not declarations of romance, but of trauma. Some victims of abuse became pregnant, and in the absence of options were forced to deliver in silence children born within convent walls and smothered before the first cry could echo. In certain regions, particularly in Spain and parts of southern Italy, it was not uncommon to find infant remains buried in convent orchards, usually unmarked, often multiple in number. The punishments for scandal were rarely proportional and often horrifying. While monks might be defrocked or sent into silent exile, nuns bore the brunt of shame and suffering. Public flagellation was rare, but not unheard of. More often, a nun who had fallen would be sentenced to perpetual enclosure, meaning she would live out her life behind a secondary wall, invisible even to the rest of the convent. Her meals were passed through a slit in the stone. She was forbidden to speak, sing, or participate in communal prayer. The justification was that her sin had tainted the sacred space, and thus she could never again be a full member of Christ's bride. In truth, it was a slow execution without death. Among the most chilling accounts is that of a nun in Saxony, who, after being accused of consorting with a visiting monk, was not tried or punished in court, but was instead boarded into her own cell. The door was sealed with bricks while she was still alive inside. Only a small hole was left to pass food and remove waste. She remained in that space for 23 years until her death. Her story survives only because of a marginal note made by a monk who repaired the cloister roof a generation later and discovered the sealed cell. He wrote, "I heard no singing from her room, only wind." There were, of course, cases where love bloomed genuinely and without violence. 2 members of the same order, falling in love, meeting in secret, whispering vows neither the Church nor their rule would allow. But even these stories often ended in ruin. Exposed lovers were treated not as tragic figures, but as traitors. The convent or monastery would undergo purification rituals, masses of atonement, and even temporary closure. The lovers themselves were never seen again, either banished, executed quietly, or sent to far-flung regions under false names. Love in the eyes of the monastic world was not merely a distraction from God. It was heresy in flesh. Thus the whispers continued. They flowed through the crypts, along the carved pews, through the winter air, in cloister gardens. The church could seal records, destroy letters, exile witnesses, but it could never fully erase the memory of those whose desires, mistakes, or victimization brought shame to sacred spaces. Behind every rule was a violation. Behind every vow, a hidden longing. And behind every silent cloister wall, the soft breath of a story that would not die. Within the cloistered world of monastic life, silence was more than a virtue, it was a weapon. Where scripture and discipline commanded quiet obedience, the very act of speaking could mark one as a traitor to the sacred order. And when it came to sexual transgressions within the monastery or convent, silence was not only imposed, it was enforced. Those who committed the crime, those who suffered it, and those who merely knew of it were all bound by the same unwritten rule: no word must ever escape the walls. Punishment, when it came, was often not about justice, but about the preservation of the illusion of holiness. The church understood that the greatest scandal was not the sin itself, but the risk of exposure. For this reason, sexual indiscretions were dealt with quickly, often quietly, and always with the intent to erase, not restore. Monastic records from the 11th to 14th centuries are riddled with vague entries and euphemisms, phrases like transferred for reasons of discretion, taken to a place of prayer and repentance, or removed due to unsuitable conduct. These were not innocent phrases. They masked expulsions, imprisonments, and even deaths. A monk caught with a fellow brother might be sent to a remote hermitage to live out the rest of his life in isolation. A nun found pregnant could be placed in solitary confinement for decades. In the most severe cases, individuals simply disappeared. The surviving community was instructed to carry on to fill the silence left behind with deeper piety and to never speak the names of the disgraced again. One of the most disturbing forms of punishment was the architectural solution to sin: the walled-in cell. Though more commonly associated with anchorites, religious hermits who voluntarily enclosed themselves for life, this method was sometimes used punitively. A small chamber, often no more than 6 feet by 4, with a single slit for food, became the final destination for nuns who had violated their vows of chastity. These women were not given trials. Their confessions, whether freely given or forced, were considered sufficient. Once sealed in, they were declared dead to the world. Their names were erased from the convent rolls, their belongings redistributed. Only the priest who brought them communion could speak to them, and even then, only through the wall. Death came slowly in such spaces by neglect, madness, or despair. In some cases, these punishments were not only cruel, but hypocritical. Male clerics who had violated women, especially those of noble birth, were often protected by their rank. Bishops and abbots accused of seduction, coercion, or even rape were quietly relocated, sometimes even promoted. It was understood that to shame a powerful man of the cloth would be to invite scandal upon the entire diocese. Instead, blame was often shifted to the women involved. Nuns were accused of worldly temptations, prideful spirit, or inviting sin through vanity. Their punishment was not only social, it was spiritual. They were denied the Eucharist, barred from singing in chapel, and in many cases forbidden to write or receive letters. In essence, they were erased from the narrative of the living church. The church's own laws on punishment for sexual misconduct were clear, at least on paper. Canon law stipulated that fornication, particularly involving those under holy vows, was a grave offense. Theoretically, monks and nuns who broke their vows could be defrocked, forced to do public penance, or sent to monasteries of stricter rule. But in practice, enforcement was selective. A noble-born nun might receive leniency or be quietly sent to a more relaxed house. A peasant-born nun could face brutal consequences, including lifelong silence or even execution if her pregnancy endangered the reputation of the convent. Likewise, monks of powerful orders, such as the Cistercians or Cluniacs, were more likely to be shielded from exposure, especially if their sin implicated others higher up the clerical ladder. Sometimes the scandal was simply too large to contain. In the 13th century, a Benedictine convent in Germany was forcibly dissolved after a bishop's investigation uncovered evidence of a decades-long pattern of sexual relations between visiting monks and the enclosed sisters. Dozens of infants had been buried in the orchard behind the convent, wrapped in linen with no names, no prayers, no records. The bishop, rather than publish his findings, chose to seal the archives and raze the convent. The land was later repurposed for a vineyard. Not a single nun was tried or mentioned again in diocesan records. This was not justice, it was obliteration. The silence imposed on victims extended beyond their lifetimes. Tombstones of disgraced monastics were left unmarked, their bodies buried in unconsecrated ground. In some rare cases, when a nun's family had power or influence, they might commission a gravestone that simply read Soror, name, called to silence. It was a final haunting admission of the punishment that defined her life. The spiritual consequences, as understood by their communities, were even more devastating. These individuals were considered to have died outside the grace of full communion. Their names were not spoken during liturgy. Their souls were left unmentioned during prayers for the dead. Yet for all the church's efforts to silence scandal stories endured, they lived in local legend, in hushed warnings passed down through generations. Some convents came to be known not for their holiness, but for the sins they tried to bury. Pilgrims would avoid them, or worse, flock to them in morbid curiosity. This is the place where the nun gave birth in winter and bled on the altar, one local legend claimed, of a convent in Normandy. Another in southern France was called the House of the Screaming Bride, a reference to a novice who went mad after being imprisoned for loving a fellow sister. What is perhaps most heartbreaking is that many of these scandals began not with lust, but with loneliness. The silence that was imposed on monastic life, while meant to elevate the spirit, often crushed the human soul. In the absence of affection, in the cold rhythms of obedience, the heart searched for warmth. Sometimes that warmth took the form of love. Sometimes it became obsession. And sometimes it became something much darker, something that preyed upon the vulnerable under the guise of spiritual guidance. Monasteries were meant to be sanctuaries, but for those caught in the web of forbidden desire and institutional silence, they could become prisons without mercy. The punishment for breaking a vow was not only physical, it was existential. To be silenced was to be made invisible. And to be invisible within the church was to be lost not just to history, but to heaven. Behind the high stone walls of medieval convents, where the Virgin was adored and silence sanctified life, often unfolded not as a tranquil retreat, but as a battleground of desire, repression, and quiet rebellion. The notion that nuns were entirely shielded from worldly temptation is a comforting myth, one long sustained by the Church's portrayal of convents as pure fortresses of chastity and devotion. In truth, many convents were hotbeds of emotional intensity, secret longing, and in some cases, dangerous liaisons that tested the very foundation of religious life. The women who entered these walls came for many reasons. Some sought spiritual purpose. Others were given by their families as acts of devotion or politics, and still others had no say at all. Girls as young as 12 were cloistered, some with little understanding of what vows truly meant. Their lives were suddenly governed by strict rules, minimal contact with the outside world, and complete surrender of the body to God. Yet the body remembers touch, even in sanctity. And within the closed circle of the convent, where only women lived, prayed, and slept beside one another, forbidden intimacy found cracks through which it could grow. Historical records, when examined with care, reveal more than occasional deviations. They unveil a subterranean world of passion, suppressed by doctrine, but not destroyed by it. Letters discovered from 15th century convents speak of spiritual friendship between sisters that crossed the threshold into romantic and physical intimacy. One such document, intercepted and copied by a suspicious bishop, described a young novice writing to her former teacher, "I feel your absence in the bed, where we used to warm each other from the night's cold. My prayers are less fervent without your breath beside me." These were not isolated sentiments. Such attachments, while officially condemned, were widely understood to exist in varying degrees across Europe's convents. Church authorities occasionally intervened when these relationships became disruptive, but more often than not, they were ignored, so long as they did not become scandalous or threaten male control. The greatest threat to order was not always the existence of love, but its visibility. When a nun became pregnant, there was no longer space for denial. The Church had systems in place to deal with such eventualities: quiet removals, fake illnesses, and forced penance cloaked under the name of spiritual retreat. Sometimes midwives loyal to the abbess would be summoned in the dead of night. The child, when born, might be taken to a foundling home or secretly buried if stillborn. In especially tragic cases, the mother might be compelled to return to her cell as if nothing had happened, the trauma stitched into her silence like thread into veil. Rumors of babies crying in convent gardens or of tiny coffins being smuggled through kitchen doors were common enough to become urban legend. But some legends had names. In 1471, the convent of Santa Margherita in northern Italy was accused of covering up the deaths of 3 infants born within a single year. A local physician, bribed into silence, later confessed that each had been the product of illicit affairs between the nuns and visiting confessors, men tasked with hearing sins and absolving guilt, who instead exploited their spiritual authority. No charges were ever filed. The bishop dissolved the convent, citing spiritual deterioration, and relocated the surviving nuns to other houses where the past would be buried with their former names. Yet even without male involvement, the boundaries between sisterhood and sensuality were often blurred. The intimacy of monastic life, communal baths, shared sleeping quarters, the complete absence of men created fertile ground for emotional entanglements. Church officials occasionally discovered diaries filled with longing, sometimes written in code, or cloaked in theological metaphor. "She is my mirror to the Lord," one nun wrote of another, "and in her kiss I feel the mercy of the angels." Officials found these writings deeply troubling. Not only did they threaten the vow of chastity, but they represented a love that could not be controlled or sanctioned by patriarchal structures. Female desire, especially when directed at other women, was viewed as unnatural, subversive, and deeply dangerous. Some nuns were excommunicated. Others were punished, more subtly denied leadership roles, cut off from correspondence, relocated to harsher convents where discipline bordered on abuse. There were other dangers, too, whispered among novices as cautionary tales. Some convents, particularly those in rural or poorly supervised areas, became sites of outright exploitation. Unscrupulous abbots or priests used their positions to enter convents under the guise of spiritual guidance and instead groomed young women for sexual use. In exchange for silence, they offered better food, more comfortable work, or promises of future leniency. When these abuses came to light rarely, they were usually dismissed as isolated incidents, blamed on possessed girls or immoral temptresses. A 14th century inquiry in Castile documents the case of 4 nuns found naked and chained in the cellar of a priory, accused of demonic submission. The report makes no mention of the monk who owned the keys to their chains. One girl died before the trial ended. The others were sent to distant convents far from the court, and their names erased from the order's records. Despite the heavy hand of punishment, not all convents responded to such events with cruelty. Some abbesses, especially those who had themselves been victims of abuse, tried to protect their sisters. In letters never meant for the public, a 16th century abbess in Avignon wrote to a fellow superior, "I fear that he returns again to our walls, and I have told the sisters to hide if they hear his voice. We pretend to be sick, to be in silent retreat. I cannot protect them all, but I can delay him." These quiet acts of resistance, though rarely documented, suggest a parallel world within the Church, one where women tried to shield each other from the very institution that claimed to safeguard their souls. Still, the price of speaking out was almost always silence. Whistleblowers, especially nuns, faced the double burden of gender and status. They were believed only when it suited authority and punished when it did not. Some wrote anonymous petitions, slipped under doors, or into the hands of visiting bishops. Others carved small symbols into wood or stone marks scholars today interpret as quiet cries for help. But for the most part, their stories went unheard, their suffering baptized under layers of liturgy, incense, and stone. The convent's walls were not just physical, they were spiritual fortresses designed to contain not only women, but the truth. Behind these walls, desire was not absent. It was merely exiled, hidden beneath hymns, behind habits, and within hearts that had no one to confess to but God, and he too was silent. Royal courts in the Middle Ages were not only centers of governance, power, and ceremony, they were theaters of manipulation, seduction, and quiet transgression. Behind the thrones and beyond the grand halls lay hidden rooms, passageways, and chambers where matters of state often blurred with matters of flesh. While official histories chronicled kings as divinely appointed rulers and queens as virtuous consorts, the lived reality within these opulent labyrinths was far more complex. Here, proximity to power often meant proximity to the king's bed. Here, bodies became currency, and secrets once whispered were rarely forgotten. Servants and courtiers knew to avert their eyes and speak only when spoken to, for they lived among tapestries that had seen too much and stones that had long gone deaf from listening. From the French Valois court to the German principalities, from the Plantagenets of England to the Iberian palaces of Castile, the courts pulsed with barely concealed scandal. Ambitious families often offered their daughters not in marriage, but in service as ladies-in-waiting dancers or cupbearers, with the unspoken hope that a glance from the king might secure their fortunes. In these courts, seduction was a language of diplomacy, and virginity, when preserved, was more valuable for negotiation than morality. Many kings had designated pleasure wings, often camouflaged as guest quarters libraries or private chapels. It was in these spaces that the most delicate negotiations occurred, not with ink and seal, but with perfume silk and skin. One infamous example is the Deer Gallery of King Louis XV at Versailles, a secret enclave within the palace where the king entertained young women, recruited from among the lower nobility, or even Parisian brothels. These women were not mere concubines. They were groomed, trained in conversation music and subtle political flattery, often tasked with delivering messages or gathering intelligence through pillow talk. For a woman born without lands or title, this was both a curse and a narrow road to influence. Some succeeded beyond all expectation, becoming mistresses powerful enough to sway foreign policy. Others were discarded quietly, their names struck from the court record, their lives ending in convents or worse. In Spain, during the reign of Philip II, the royal court at El Escorial held secrets in its architecture. Beneath its vast granite exterior were chambers shielded from the gaze of the church and court alike. Documents from a former steward, uncovered centuries later, reference a garden beneath the stone, a euphemism for a pleasure chamber concealed behind the chapel. According to the account, only the king and a trusted few had keys to these rooms. Women were brought in through service entrances blindfolded, so they could never reveal the layout. Some were noble women, fallen from favor. Others were prisoners pardoned in exchange for their silence. No records confirm what happened in those rooms, but the same steward who wrote of them also recorded the sudden disappearance of several servants and two sisters who had once been favored ladies-in-waiting. Their names do not appear in any royal funeral log. Royal mistresses, while often romanticized today, lived precarious lives. One misstep, a letter discovered, a rival's accusation, a pregnancy exposed, could spell exile or death. A king's favor was a double-edged sword. To be chosen was to be elevated, yes, but also to be scrutinized, resented, and often destroyed when no longer useful. Lady Alice Perrers, mistress to Edward III of England, rose to unprecedented influence in court affairs, wearing the Queen's jewels and whispering in the ears of judges. But after the king's death, she was stripped of her wealth, declared a criminal, and forced to beg her way back into royal favor. She succeeded only because the new king saw value in keeping her secrets hidden. Some queens, contrary to the image of passive dignity, were deeply aware of these dynamics and sometimes wielded them for their own ends. Isabella of France, wife of Edward II, was known to quietly monitor her husband's favorites and strategically place her own confidants within reach of his affections. Such maneuvers were not always about love or lust. They were about power. A bedmate with the king's ear could become an instrument of the queen's will, or a threat that had to be neutralized. In one instance, a young lady-in-waiting, who had caught the king's interest, was suddenly reassigned to a remote convent within a week of Isabella's private audience with the chamberlain. The girl later wrote, "The queen's eyes were colder than the stone beneath her feet, and yet she smiled as she banished me. I do not know which was worse." Liaisons were not always confined to royal men. Some queens and noble women maintained their own discreet entanglements. Eleanor of Aquitaine, before and during her marriage to Henry II, was rumored to have had close ties to her troubadours, not merely artistic, but deeply personal. While historical proof remains elusive, poetic dedications, written in veiled language, suggest relationships that blurred the lines between patronage and passion. A famous Occitan song, attributed to one of her favorites, reads, "Her command is my prayer, her touch the sun. No king shall keep me from her shadow." The Church condemned such poetry as heresy not only for its romantic overtones, but for its subtle challenge to patriarchal control. Physical spaces in these courts were designed to enable secrecy. Hidden staircases, two-way mirrors, and narrow passages allowed for quiet movements in the dead of night. In Prague Castle, a narrow corridor known as the Whisper Tunnel connected the Queen's chambers to a chapel below, but also to the royal stables, where a young stablemaster was once accused of bedding both the Queen and one of her daughters. He was executed publicly, his body quartered and displayed. The women were never officially implicated, though they were each sent to religious houses within the month. Beneath all of this lay an unwritten rule: so long as discretion was maintained, the game could continue. But once made, public love became treason. Desire in the royal court was never simply about passion. It was a form of influence, a tool, and a risk. Every sigh behind a tapestry, every glance across the hall, every meeting behind a curtain carried with it the potential for power or ruin. And though kings ruled with crowns, it was often the whispers in the bedchamber that decided the fates of nations. Amid the glitter of medieval courts and the solemn rituals of divine kingship, there existed institutions far less sanctified, yet no less essential to the machinery of power. Royal brothels, often euphemistically referred to as bathhouses, silk houses, or pleasure halls, were unofficially sanctioned spaces where physical appetite met political necessity. These were not dens of lawless vice, but meticulously regulated establishments. Many operated under the tacit approval of kings, bishops, and nobles alike. Their purpose stretched beyond mere carnal gratification. They served as tools of diplomacy, intelligence, and control. In these spaces, desire could be managed, watched, and used. The best documented example is the Stews of Southwark in London, a district of licensed brothels situated just outside the jurisdiction of the City of London. Operated on lands owned by the Bishop of Winchester, these establishments paid regular fees and followed strict rules: no women who were married, no solicitation on Sundays, no harboring of thieves or fugitives. Yet within these boundaries, the brothels flourished, catering not only to merchants and sailors, but to members of court who sought discretion outside palace walls. The women of the Stews were not the lowest of society. Some were highly educated, multilingual, and capable of entertaining ambassadors. It was whispered that several mistresses of Edward IV had once worked in the Southwark houses before entering royal service. In France, during the reign of Charles VI, a notorious establishment near the Rue Saint-Denis, known simply as La Maison Rouge, became an open secret among the aristocracy. Decorated like a miniature palace, it hosted themed rooms, musical performances, and masked balls. Nobles arranged rendezvous there not only for pleasure, but for negotiation trade deals and espionage. A Venetian emissary wrote in 1402, "The House of Red is not a brothel. It is a parliament of flesh, where men speak more freely than in any court chamber." The madam, a former lady-in-waiting exiled for a scandalous affair, kept ledgers of her guests, not for blackmail, but for protection. Those pages discovered centuries later included names of 3 royal princes, 2 bishops, and the secret visits of a queen's brother. The royal involvement in such places was not accidental. Kings often allowed or encouraged their existence as pressure valves. Repressing physical desire among a volatile and armed nobility was dangerous. A night of indulgence at a royal brothel was preferable to a seduction scandal within the palace. Some rulers even arranged for their household staff, particularly unmarried soldiers or guards, to frequent regulated houses instead of taking risks with chambermaids or noblewomen. It was a quiet way of preserving court order. Even the church, officially condemning fornication, looked the other way, so long as the brothels remained discreet, taxable, and distant from ecclesiastical property. One of the more unusual examples comes from the court of Emperor Frederick II, whose palace in Sicily was known for its intellectual and sensual openness. Records suggest the emperor commissioned a private house of pleasure near Palermo, staffed not only with women, but with dancers, poets, and musicians from across the Mediterranean. The purpose was as much cultural as erotic. Visitors were encouraged to discuss philosophy between encounters, and political guests were entertained there as a sign of trust. The emperor saw it as an extension of his court, a place where the veil of performance could fall and honesty, however licentious, could surface. Rumors claimed that treaties were signed there under candlelight, sealed with both ink and flesh. Brothels also served as shadow courts of their own, where information passed between sheets and silence could be bought more reliably than loyalty. Royal agents often infiltrated them, paying women for intelligence gathered from careless noblemen who whispered secrets in their drunken haze. Courtesans trained in discretion and memory became valuable informants. One particularly well-documented case involves a French courtesan known only as Margot de la Tour, who relayed military plans discussed by a drunken duke to the king's spy network in 1478, preventing an attempted coup. Margot disappeared 2 years later, her fate unknown, but court records show a sudden pension granted to her sister in the countryside, a quiet reward for services rendered. Yet not all brothels were hidden behind the veil of royal strategy. Some were little more than dens of abuse, where women were trafficked and discarded their suffering, obscured by the glamour of courtly indulgence. The dual nature of these institutions, both empowered and exploited, remained constant. For every courtesan who rose to fame like Agnes Sorel, there were countless others who died unknown, buried in paupers' graves behind city walls. The hierarchy within these brothels was brutal. Those who could entertain the rich survived. Those who aged resisted or fell ill were quietly removed. In places like Avignon during the papal residency in the 14th century, brothels operated under clerical oversight. The contradiction was glaring. Cardinals preached chastity by day and visited bathhouses by night. Some theologians argued that such sin, if managed, was less dangerous than suppressed urges. Better the sin of the body than the rebellion of the heart, wrote one monk. This rationalization persisted throughout the medieval era. Controlled vice was preferable to uncontrolled scandal. Public knowledge of royal visits to brothels was often suppressed, yet not always. In 15th century Portugal, King João II was caught leaving a Lisbon establishment disguised as a sailor. The incident sparked outrage not for the act itself, but for the audacity of a king mingling so directly with the masses. His defenders argued it was a necessary disguise for investigative purposes. The madam of the house was found drowned days later, officially a suicide, though many believed otherwise. Some royal brothels became legends woven into ballads and cautionary tales. One such story tells of the Velvet Den, a mythical English house said to have hosted Henry VIII in his youth. According to the tale, he fathered a child there who later became a monk, unknowingly confessing to his royal father decades later. Whether true or not, the story reveals a deep cultural awareness of how close the lines between sin and sovereignty truly lay. At their core, royal brothels were reflections of medieval society's contradictions: virtue proclaimed, vice practiced; love idealized, desire bought; women sanctified as queens or scorned as harlots. These establishments were not separate from the court. They were an extension of it, functioning as both outlet and arena. Here, in scented rooms, lit by firelight and silenced by gold kings, were no longer symbols, they were men. And the crown, no matter how divine, always came with a hidden key to the back door of the palace. In a world where power was draped in velvet, and bloodlines where kings claimed divine right and ruled over courts of men, and their silent, glittering consorts, it was often assumed that queens were passive figures, symbols of fertility, piety, and obedience. But history, when peeled back from its official portraits, reveals a different truth. There were women who wore their crowns like daggers, who navigated a court of wolves, not by shrinking, but by sharpening their instincts. These were queens who turned the tables not only on men, but on the very system that sought to use them. They mastered the game of appearances, knowing that true power in the medieval court was not always taken by force. It was often taken in whispers, in smiles, and in the precise moment a secret was offered or withheld. Take Isabella of France, the wife of Edward II of England. To the court, she was the dutiful queen, married young, draped in silks, her gaze soft beside her husband. But behind her calm presence lay a mind that observed and remembered. As Edward lavished favor and titles on his male companions, first Piers Gaveston, then Hugh Despenser, Isabella bided her time. Denied affection, stripped of lands, her children taken from her, she traveled to France under the pretext of diplomacy. There, she forged alliances, gathered mercenaries, and returned not as wife, but as warrior. In 1326, she invaded England with an army and the support of the nobility. Within months, Edward was captured, Despenser executed, and Isabella was regent of the realm. For 4 years, she ruled England in all but name, a queen who had rewritten the rules of her position. In Burgundy, Margaret of York, sister to Edward IV, married Charles the Bold not simply as a political pawn, but as a woman determined to carve her own domain. Though childless, she wielded influence over court appointments, engaged in international correspondence, and fostered humanist scholars. Her court became a haven for poets and strategists. When Charles died and Burgundy fell into crisis, Margaret managed the transition of power, negotiating with France, raising troops, and protecting her stepdaughter's inheritance. Even in widowhood, she remained a power player, financing rebellions and harboring pretenders to the English throne. Her life was a quiet defiance, a queen without heirs who nonetheless birthed revolutions. Then there was Eleanor of Aquitaine, perhaps the most notorious of them all. Married first to Louis VII of France and then to Henry II of England, she crossed the boundaries of power, not once, but twice. After being Queen of France, she became Queen of England, mother to two kings, Richard the Lionheart and John, and was imprisoned for supporting her sons in rebellion against their father. Yet even from her confinement, she managed correspondence, arranged marriages, and maintained her network. Once released, she became regent during Richard's crusades and ransom, governing with clarity and force. She traveled across Europe in her 70s, securing alliances and protecting her dynasty. To be a queen in name was one thing, to be a queen in action entirely another. Many women of court found power in less visible ways. They used patronage as their sword. They commissioned churches, sponsored poets, and funded colleges not only as acts of piety, but as political statements. A chapel bearing a queen's name was a legacy no decree could erase. A favored scholar might later rise to become a bishop loyal to the queen's bloodline. Even their fashions held coded messages. A specific color, worn at a feast, could signal loyalty or defiance. Embroidered emblems whispered allegiances when words were too dangerous. Queens became fluent in the language of the court, its silences, its gestures, its veiled insults and disguised ambitions. In Castile, Queen Urraca reigned as monarch in her own right in the early 12th century, refusing to cede control even after pressure to remarry for stability. Her reign was marked by warfare and church opposition, yet she held her throne, often commanding troops directly. Chroniclers called her scandalous, but she signed her name as Empress of all Spain. Her power was not a gift, it was seized, defended, and ultimately endured. Another queen, Hedwig of Poland, ascended the throne at just 10 years old, not as consort, but as king, in title Rex, not Regina. She ruled with wisdom and piety, marrying for diplomacy, but negotiating terms that preserved her autonomy. She founded schools, supported reforms, and was eventually canonized her life, a model of leadership, grounded not in submission, but strategy. These women understood that in a patriarchal system, power was rarely offered, it was repurposed. When barred from council chambers, they influenced from behind curtains. When denied command, they shaped succession. When confined to childbearing, they turned their sons into weapons, educating them not only in warfare, but in the political language of legacy. Some went further, cultivating networks of spies, ladies-in-waiting, who served as informants and confessors who relayed the sins of their rivals. The queen's chamber was often the most dangerous room in the palace, not because of its swords, but because of its secrets. Their enemies called them witches, seductresses, meddlers, or unnatural women. But what they feared was not their femininity, it was their refusal to be irrelevant. These queens did not usurp power. They clarified its terms. They exposed the contradiction of a court that expected them to be vessels of obedience while quietly punishing them for being too passive. In turning the tables, they proved that womanhood in court was not weakness, it was camouflage. Beneath the jewels and the choreography of daily rituals was a mind as sharp as any sword watching, waiting, remembering. Their legacies linger not just in stained glass or tomb effigies, but in the very structure of monarchy itself. They changed how queenship was understood, not as ornament, but as instrument. Not as a station beneath the king, but as a parallel court of its own. And so, the Game of Thrones often told through male blood, and war must also be told through female hands, gloved, perfumed, but no less ruthless. The queens who turned the tables remind us that silence was not absence. It was strategy. And when they finally spoke, the whole court listened. In the candlelit corners of medieval castles beyond the shimmering tapestries and ceremonial banquets, another reality festered, one that no court chronicler dared record in gold-leaf script. For beneath the crowns and courtly dances was a world steeped in bodily frailty, illness, and the crude mechanisms of survival. The royal court, for all its silks and etiquette, was not immune to the stink of chamber pots, the wheeze of plague lungs, or the humiliations of dying kings in soiled linens. Disease, that great equalizer, stalked the halls of the mighty with as much cruelty as it haunted the peasantry. Royal physicians, schooled in Galenic theory and humoral imbalance, bled their monarchs, applied leeches, and prescribed potions made from crushed emeralds or powdered mummy, all with more confidence than efficacy. Kings and queens, seated on their thrones, were often plagued by ailments that today would seem minor, but then spelled agony or death tooth abscesses, infected wounds, kidney stones, parasites, and most infamously, dysentery. Edward the Faun of England, in his final campaign against the Scots, died not in battle, but of a persistent illness, his body racked with fever and foul discharges. Philip II of Spain, the ruler of the most powerful empire of his day, spent his final months in a room that reeked of rot. His leg eaten away by gangrene, his cries echoing down the palace corridors, while priests read scripture beside him, and servants emptied bloodied basins. Even the design of royal toilets or garderobes reflected the uneasy balance between ceremony and survival. Some were little more than wooden benches, with holes cut above shafts descending into cesspits. Others were adorned with carved seats and draped curtains, but the function remained crude. Servants known as gong farmers or nightmen had the grim duty of removing the waste their lives spent knee-deep in filth that ran beneath the halls of the elite. No perfume or protocol could disguise the fact that every court was built atop layers of human waste. Hygiene was a performance more than a practice. Royals bathed infrequently, believing water opened the pores to disease. Instead, they changed linens often and applied scented oils. Queens wore pomanders, small spheres filled with herbs and spices strung around their necks or tucked into sleeves to combat the miasmas of illness and poor sanitation. Incense burned constantly in royal chapels and chambers, not only for spiritual reverence, but to mask the odor of decay. Illness was not merely physical, it carried political consequence. A coughing king stirred rumors of succession. A queen's miscarriage could incite whispers of divine punishment or infidelity. The health of a monarch was a matter of state, and yet it was shrouded in secrecy. Courtiers speculated foreign spies waited for slips of the tongue, and royal scribes glossed over the truth. The appearance of vigor was vital even if the king ruled from a sickbed. Henry IV of France suffered debilitating skin diseases, likely eczema or psoriasis, his body often covered in sores and flaking skin. Yet he maintained a vibrant public image, appearing on horseback and in hunt, dousing himself in perfume to cover the condition. The court did not ask questions. To see a monarch bleed, groan, or weep in pain was to confront the fiction of divine right. And so those moments were hidden, shielded by thick curtains and loyal attendants. But behind those curtains, the court bore witness to slow, undignified deaths. Monarchs choked on their own tongues, passed worms in their stools, hallucinated under mercury treatment for syphilis, or endured surgeries without anesthesia. The royal body was a battlefield where physicians, astrologers, priests, and alchemists all fought for influence, none with certainty. Female members of the court faced their own brutal trials. Childbirth was a high-stakes ordeal, often carried out in crowded, smoky rooms where prayers mingled with screams. Queens were expected to deliver heirs, yet they faced death each time they labored. A breech birth, a retained placenta, or postpartum infection could claim a life within hours. Mary Tudor, after a series of phantom pregnancies, died childless and despondent, her body a symbol of failed dynastic hope. Fertility itself became a matter of court gossip and theological debate. When a queen miscarried or failed to conceive, the blame was rarely shared equally. Remedies ranged from chastity belts soaked in holy water to diets of crushed pearls and deer testicles. And if a queen survived childbirth, she was often expected to return to duty swiftly to produce more heirs to attend court to carry on. Her pain was not a private affair. It was a matter of succession. Amid these bodily trials, superstition flourished. Illness was interpreted as punishment from God or signs of witchcraft. A mole on a queen's shoulder could be deemed a witch's mark. A miscarriage might be blamed on a jealous rival. Court physicians consulted astrology charts before prescribing remedies. Mercury, arsenic, and lead were administered as cures. Bleeding was a common treatment, weakening already frail bodies. No one understood germ theory. To the court, invisible forces ruled the body just as surely as they ruled the heavens. Yet amid the filth and fear, rituals arose. The act of caring for a dying monarch became a sacred duty. Servants bathed the bodies of kings with rose water, changed their linens, held their hands during final breaths. Queens were mourned in elaborate processions, their bodies displayed on catafalques, adorned with crowns and scepters, even if those bodies had been ravaged by childbirth or fever. Death was sanitized in death masks and gilded effigies, but the truth lingered in the memory of chambermaids and physicians. The throne was not just a seat of power, it was a seat of suffering. Its occupants bled, vomited, and defecated like anyone else. Behind the illusion of majesty was a pulsing, fragile body, always one infection away from collapse. The chamber pot, kept beneath the throne, was not just a practical object. It was a symbol of the inescapable truth that even kings must bow to the body's decay. In time, the stench of sickness was cleared. The linens replaced the banners raised anew. A new monarch would ascend, greeted with cheers, dressed in finery, but beneath their feet, in the same rooms, in the same halls, the memory of death remained. The court went on, pretending that power was eternal, that the throne conferred more than illusion. Yet every cough, every limp, every groan behind closed doors told a different story. The story of monarchs not as gods, but as bodies wounded, aging mortal. In the shadowy alcoves of medieval courts, where whispers carried further than banners and trust was thinner than parchment, the most lethal threats to a monarch's life did not come from foreign swords, but from within their own banquet halls. Poison, that invisible and insidious enemy, became the great equalizer, able to slip past armor bypass guards and nestle into goblets of wine or bowls of spiced stew. And alongside it, the noose, the silent silken kind, woven from intrigue and betrayal, tightened around royal throats without ever making a sound. Fear in the court was constant and never unfounded. Power bred envy, and envy fermented into treason. A monarch could lose everything, not in battle, but in a moment of careless trust. A sip taken too early, a hand extended to the wrong ally, a whispered lie heard too late. Death came not always with thunder, but with silence and aching stomach, a sudden sweat, the blood vomiting forth after an innocent meal. Monarchs learned to fear their food. Royal tasters were not a luxury, they were a necessity. Men and women were paid to eat the first bite of every dish drink from the first pour of every cup. Some kings would even rotate their staff constantly, never letting one servant grow too close. Others refused to eat meals prepared outside their own watch. The kitchens themselves became sites of paranoia. Access restricted ingredients, guarded cooks monitored by guards. Lead-glazed plates and pewter utensils unknowingly contributed to their fears. Food slowly laced with lead or arsenic left victims weak, irritable, and increasingly unwell symptoms chalked up to bad humors or stress, but in truth, often poisoning. Catherine de' Medici's court was infamous for its alchemists and apothecaries. Her pantry was said to house exotic toxins from distant lands, venoms extracted from snakes, herbs distilled into tinctures. It is debated how much was used, but the fear alone was enough to shape policy change, marriages and alliances. A royal death was always suspicious. Did the wine come from Burgundy or from a trader's cellar? Was the fainting queen merely exhausted or slowly being eliminated? Assassination could be elegant, hidden in a perfume, or smeared on a page. Poisoned gloves, ink and cosmetics, nothing was beyond suspicion. To be a monarch was to be perpetually hunted by unseen hands. The court became a performance of mutual distrust. Courtiers bowed deeply, smiled gracefully, and toasted with trembling hands. Behind every gesture was calculation, whose favor to seek, whose weakness to exploit, whose ambition burned too brightly. In this theater of politeness, betrayal wore silk and pearls. Women especially mastered the politics of subtlety. Forbidden from open warfare, they learned the art of intrigue, murmured warnings, sudden illnesses, changes in inheritance. A miscarriage blamed on herbs, a brother-in-law weakened by his own servants. Some queens were victims, others orchestrators. Lucrezia Borgia, for instance, is forever entangled in tales of poison rings and deadly dinners, though much remains legend. The truth matters less than the fear her name still evokes. Murder was not always done with tools. Words could kill too. A false rumor could drive a monarch to execute a trusted advisor. A forged letter could ignite a rebellion. The court scribes, spies, and stewards were all as dangerous as any knight. A whisper in the right ear at the wrong time could cost a prince his head. The Tower of London held many such victims, sons, brothers, consorts, all undone, not by blades, but by accusations and sealed parchments. Executions often followed such betrayals, but rarely were the reasons clear. Charges of heresy, sorcery, treason, vague enough to fit any enemy. A condemned man might have plotted nothing, but remained too close to power. A queen might fall from favor and find her household dispersed. Her servants interrogated her jewelry, seized before the scaffold rose at dawn. Even within marriage, monarchs were not safe. Consorts became liabilities. Anne Boleyn was queen one spring, and beheaded by summer, her fall as rapid as her rise. In the end, what mattered wasn't guilt or innocence, but momentum. Political tides shifted, and heads rolled with them. Poison could do what armies could not unseat a ruler without a war. But it was not the only silent killer. The noose, literal and symbolic, loomed in every court. It might take the form of a friendly advisor, turning coat, or a council vote turned against the sovereign. And sometimes it was actual rope. Noblemen hanged for imagined plots, queens strangled behind locked doors, princes found suffocated in their beds. Their deaths recorded in vague lines. He died suddenly. She passed in the night. It was God's will. The archives whispered more than they revealed. Over time, monarchs hardened. They became guarded, suspicious, often cruel. The fear shaped them. Louis XIII of France kept astrologers and secret police, rarely trusting even his closest circle. Ivan the Terrible turned his own palace into a fortress within a fortress, believing his food poisoned and his soul hunted. He was not entirely wrong. Kings went mad with fear because the threats were real. Yet even in such darkness, life at court continued, with music-hunting banquets and births. One day, a duke toasted the queen. The next, he was arrested for treason. The same hand that served you lamb might serve you poison. The same mistress who whispered love might whisper death. And always, the poisoners walked among the living, their names unknown, their methods undetected. A little belladonna in wine, a touch of mercury in ointment, a dusting of arsenic in a pie. Death disguised as sweetness. And should you survive the first cup, there were always others waiting. The throne itself was a poison chalice offering power, but demanding vigilance. No one ruled without consequence. Even the most beloved monarchs died with suspicion swirling around their deathbeds. Who stood to gain? Who moved too quickly to inherit? Who ordered the kitchen staff changed at the last moment? Every death echoed down corridors for decades. Even centuries later, historians argue over what truly ended a reign, natural cause or subtle murder. And in this theater of death, where every cup could be laced, every smile could be a dagger, monarchs did not live, they lingered. Their lives were not grand arcs, but cautious steps through a minefield of alliances, hatreds, and invisible enemies. The banquet table was a battlefield, and the cup, never quite empty, was always suspect. The crown, though gleaming with jewels and layered in silk and gold, was often a curse heavier than the mind could bear. For those born to rule or forced onto thrones by birth blood or the will of scheming advisors, the burden was not merely of governance, but of isolation, paranoia, and unbearable expectations. Across the medieval world, some monarchs fractured under the weight, retreating into fantasy violence or silence, while their courts whispered of madness behind embroidered sleeves. In these regal prisons, the walls were thick with silence, and the mirrors did not reflect reality. Madness in royalty was not a curiosity, it was a threat to the realm. The king's sanity was the kingdom's spine. If he cracked, everything else trembled, and yet many did. Charles VI of France once believed he was made of glass, refusing to let anyone touch him, afraid that a simple stumble might shatter his bones. His court, paralyzed by the need to maintain the illusion of order, tiptoed around his condition, both literally and politically. Curtains were drawn tighter, and his moments of lucidity were clutched like rare gems. He reigned in name, while others maneuvered behind tapestries. Joanna of Castile, remembered cruelly as Joanna the Mad, was perhaps less broken than she was broken by others. Her devotion to her deceased husband became a source of mockery as she refused to part from his corpse, traveling with it and whispering lullabies to bones. Whether her grief was pathological or merely misunderstood remains debated, but the men around her, powerful ones who benefited from her weakness, found it convenient to lock her away. And there, in a cloistered palace, she faded into obscurity, her name smeared with the ink of others. Madness, real or fabricated, was a political tool. To declare a monarch unfit was to open the door to regency, or worse, overthrow. Enemies of the crown, or even family members, often fostered rumors of mental instability to seize control. A ruler who wept too often, refused to speak, or wandered at night might be whispered of as touched by the devil or possessed by spirits. The church sometimes became involved, and spiritual diagnoses gave way to very worldly punishments: confinement, exile, poison tonics, or remedies that resembled torture. The balance was delicate. A mad king was dangerous, but so was the act of declaring him mad. If he recovered or retaliated, those who spoke ill of him might face execution. Thus, many royal courts lived in a state of suspended disbelief, pretending sanity where none remained, maintaining ceremonies even as the sovereign muttered to shadows. King Henry VI of England spent long months in catatonic silence, unresponsive even as his son was born. His illness, believed by many to be inherited from the French line, coincided with the Wars of the Roses, a brutal era where power shifted like sand. As Henry's mind ebbed and flowed, his enemies grew bold and the kingdom fractured. Madness here became not just a personal tragedy, but a national one. It was not always the kings who crumbled. Queens, princesses, and consorts, especially those confined to cold and quiet quarters, often unraveled in private. Some were plagued by visions, others by melancholia so deep it rendered them inert. Court physicians prescribed leeches, cold baths, or bleeding, believing the mind to be governed by humors. There was no concept of mental health, only imbalance, demonic interference, or divine punishment. And so those who suffered found themselves both pitied and feared. The mad monarch was a terrifying paradox: God-appointed, yet fallible, holy, yet vulnerable, elevated, yet broken. Their caged minds were mirrored by the caged palaces they inhabited, gilded cages, where windows opened onto gardens, but not freedom. Rituals continued, even when understanding ceased. A mad king might sit upon the throne during feasts, smiling at invisible guests, while ministers quietly directed policy. Some kings in their madness imagined themselves peasants. Others conversed with the dead. And still, others unable to distinguish fantasy from law-issued edicts based on dreams or delusions. The court, often unable to challenge the monarch, directly engaged in a grim dance, obeying nonsense, reinterpreting commands, forging signatures, or gently steering decisions to mitigate disaster. In some cases, the monarch's madness brought unexpected clarity. Caligula, centuries earlier in Rome, was said to have appointed his horse to the Senate, interpreted by some scholars as satire rather than lunacy. In the medieval era, there were monarchs whose hallucinations birthed poetry, whose obsessions with music or silence shaped court culture. But more often, it brought cruelty. A king in the grip of delusion might order mass executions convinced of conspiracies. Others beat servants cursed at paintings or demanded impossible spectacles. The fear was constant. Servants learned to step softly to answer without challenging, to agree without question. For those within the royal circle, the monarch's illness was both intimate and terrifying. Some tried to cure it with herbs, with isolation, with bloodletting or prayer. Others tried to exploit it. If the king signed a death warrant in madness, was it valid? Could a queen be crowned beside a man who no longer recognized her? The line between private suffering and public crisis was blurred. And outside the court, rumors spread faster than facts. Peasants feared a mad king would tax them into starvation or start wars with invisible enemies. Foreign diplomats watched with sharp eyes, waiting to pounce on weakness. And within the palace walls, the monarch wandered the halls, muttering to tapestries, avoiding mirrors, perhaps unaware that they wore the crown at all. The caged world of the mad monarch was, in truth, a mirror of the entire royal life. Even the sane were prisoners trapped by expectation, hunted by paranoia, cut off from common joy. But madness stripped the illusion away. It exposed how fragile the system truly was. A single mind unraveling at the center of power could bring down a dynasty. And so the monarch's every twitch was watched, every silence dissected, every outburst feared. The robes and scepters remained, but the person beneath became a shadow. In the end, many of them died quietly out of sight, locked in towers, hidden in monasteries, or embalmed in golden caskets before their names could be spoken with shame. And the world moved on, as it always did, crowning new rulers with trembling hands, hoping each time that this one would remain sane. Not every death in medieval courts came with swords drawn or banners raised. Some arrived in silence on slippered feet, with the faint scent of lavender oil masking the poison. In the corridors of power, where thrones teetered on alliances and crowns rested on uneasy brows, assassination was not merely an act of violence. It was a language, a message, a tool of governance in a world where law was fragile and ambition endless. Beneath the candlelit halls of power, assassins walked among chamberlains, cupbearers, and concubines. They were not always killers in black hoods, but nurses, scribes, or confessors, those trusted enough to draw near, yet invisible in their closeness. When kings and queens feared open rebellion, they often faced a more insidious threat, death by the hands of those who smiled politely and bowed the lowest. Poison was the favored method, silent, untraceable, and often slow enough to avoid suspicion. It transformed every goblet into a gamble. A sip of wine, a bite of bread. These became acts of trust, rituals of vulnerability. Taster servants were employed, but they could not detect every method. Some poisons were brewed from exotic plants, imported through trade routes that spanned deserts and seas. Others were made in the very palace gardens under the noses of the innocent. Belladonna arsenic monkshood ingredients, as deadly as they were beautiful. Courts developed elaborate defenses meals, prepared in locked kitchens sealed with wax, food brought under guard, royal cups carved from unicorn horn, falsely believed to detect poison. But it was never enough. Assassination was not a mere crime, it was an art form. In Byzantium, it became a craft refined through generations. In Italy, families like the Borgias allegedly mastered it, using poison, not just for defense, but as a strategy of empire building. Rumors swirled of popes falling dead after a single supper of rings that delivered death with a scratch of candles that melted into noxious fumes. And though many of these stories are tangled in myth, the fear they inspired was very real. The idea that death could come not from armies, but from a single dinner guest changed the nature of power. Monarchs grew paranoid. Some refused to sleep in the same bed twice, or kept multiple identical food platters to confuse any would-be plotters. Others slept with weapons beneath their pillows, or dismissed entire staffs at the hint of suspicion. But even these defenses failed when the enemy was within the family. Royal assassins were not always strangers. History holds countless tales of sons killing fathers, brothers, poisoning brothers, queens plotting against their own kin. The throne was a solitary seat, and blood ties were no guarantee of loyalty. In some courts, death by betrayal became almost expected, an unspoken tradition among ruling houses. In the Ottoman Empire, fratricide was institutionalized. A new sultan would often begin his reign by executing his brothers lest they rise in rebellion. Strangled with silk cords to avoid the sin of shedding blood, these brothers died not for crimes, but for what they might one day do. It was assassination in ceremonial form, disguised as necessity. In other kingdoms, the blade came less openly. A rival might fall ill mysteriously just days before ascending to the throne. A duke might tumble from a high window accidentally, of course. A princess might never wake from sleep, her final breath lost to a draught of nightshade mixed in her cordial. The killer's hands remained clean, but the court always knew. It was in the sudden silences, the vanished attendants, the swift changes in inheritance. And yet punishment rarely followed. In many cases, there was no justice to be found, for the killer often sat on the throne the next morning. Assassination was both sin and solution. When a ruler became mad, cruel, or incompetent, the nobles whispered of a necessary end. A knife in the night might save a kingdom, they reasoned. Assassination in this sense was politics sharpened to a point. But even the most successful assassins often met grim ends. Power gained through blood left stains impossible to hide. Guilt turned allies into threats, and the assassin, once invisible, became a marked man. Many killers were eliminated after their usefulness faded silence to preserve the new order. Others, consumed by fear or guilt, lived lives of exile or madness. The sword that brought down a king often claimed its wielder too. Yet still, the assassins came. From the shadows of Italy to the palaces of Persia, there were always those willing to trade silence for silver, to murder for ideology, vengeance, or favor. Some were mercenaries. Others believed they served a greater cause. The Hashashin of the Islamic world were infamous, an order cloaked in mystery, known for daring precise strikes and loyalty unto death. Their very name became the root of the word assassin. They sent messages with blades instead of parchment. Their victims often found dead in locked rooms, knives beside their hearts. Fear of them shaped empires. In Europe, the concept of assassination crept into political philosophy. Was it right to remove a tyrant? Could one death prevent 1,000 writers debated regicide in secret, knowing that to speak of it openly was treason? Yet the idea never vanished. Even today, the echoes of that question remain. The danger of assassination reshaped architecture. Thrones were raised above crowds. Corridors narrowed to limit ambush. Secret tunnels led from chambers to rivers or forests, offering escape routes. Guards were trained not just in swordplay, but in reading eyes, sniffing for toxins, sensing deception. Even the design of banquet tables changed. Circular forms became common to limit blind spots. In truth, the medieval court was less a place of opulence than of constant vigilance. Assassination was always an option, sometimes the only one. And so kings learned to distrust everyone. Lovers' advisors, even their own children, were seen not just as family, but as potential executioners. Some monarchs died in peace, it's true, but many met ends whispered in darkness with no battlefield glory, no martyr's death, only a chill in the throat, a bitter taste on the tongue, and the sound of velvet footsteps fading down a stone hallway.